Welcome back, legends. I hope you've all had a fantastic week. It is time for yet another installment of Friday Q&A. If you would like me to answer one of your questions on next week's Q&A video, simply put it in the comment section below and I will do my best to get to it. If you check the video description of this video, you can check out a variety of different ways to support what I do here on the channel, whether it's Patreon, whether it is buying some of the music that I make with Ragdoll, or buying something like our double LP, which you can see behind me over here, Shill. Otherwise, you can also check the description to join the Discord server and get some free stuff like some cabinet IRs. Let's get into this week's questions. Pedals before an amp or in the effects loop? It obviously depends on the type of pedals. If I'm feeling super normcore, then I'm going to put stuff like pitch detune, delay, and reverb in the amp's effects loop, or I'm going to place them after the preamp section. For a variety of different reasons. The main one is that if you're running stereo, then you can take a mono signal with all your distortion and processing on it and get stereo time-based effects. However, I generally like stuff like a chorus or a flanger or a univibe before distortion. When it comes to stuff like EQs and compressors, again, that's something that you could put in different places for different results. I will say though that want to kind of get old school, I would put a delay in front of some distortion, but it would be something like a slapback tape delay or an analog delay. I think the great thing is that that's me being super conservative. Sometimes you don't want to do that. Sometimes you want to do something like, say, a delay into a compressor, into a reverb, into an EQ, into a fuzz, into an EHX microsynth, and you just want to use that sound for a particular part of a song. And I guess it's strange talking about like orthodoxy with this kind of stuff when guitar is kind of predicated on breaking the rules. You know, if you think about what most people think of when they think of a guitar tone, they probably think of some kind of distortion. And, you know, back in the day, distortion was undesirable. It was a bad thing, but distorted electric guitar, it's kind of why I live my life. I love that sound so much. So doing things in a particular order that you know works is always super fun. And it's also super fun to just turn that order around. So, I mean, if you've got something like an Axe Effects, maybe try put your cabinet IR before your amp and go totally crazy. Let me know how that goes. What would I choose as a single rack space effects processing unit for something like a Synergy rack-based setup? Would I go with something like a TCG Major, or would I go for a Lexicon MPX1, something else, both? I have mentioned a couple of times that I do want to do a video on like the cheapest to the most expensive rack setup, and that is something I am working on. I think a large part of that video is going to focus on the kind of mid-level stuff, and my personal two favorite units that are not super expensive or hard to find would be something like a Rocktron IntelliFX or Replifex and a Lexicon MPX1. I do like the TC stuff. I used to gig a G major with a JMP1, and I love the tones I got from that. The G major is cool because it can do relay switching as well, but in a system like the Synergy system, you've got MIDI, so that is a little bit redundant. But I just love the tones you can get from the MPX1. The reverbs on it are amazing, the delays are fantastic, and you do kind of have to be careful in how you allocate resources. I've got an MPX G2, which gives you a little bit more power, gives you the option of having like distortion and some compressors and EQs that are in the analog domain. That would probably be my pick for just a single unit that works. The IntelliFX is awesome though because it's got analog drive-through. The Replifex does the same thing as well. So maybe like a Replifex into your preamp, into your MPX would be a pretty killer setup that would give you a lot of great tones in a really nice compact rack. Gain staging with an FR setup, we're talking about, you know, do I turn my monitor all the way up and use the volume control on my modeler, or do I turn my modeler all the way up and use the volume control on my FR? I'm certain that somebody can weigh in the comments that there is going to be an optimal way to gain stage this to get the best signal to noise ratio. But honestly, I don't think it matters that much as long as you're not clipping anything that you don't want to clip. I would probably crank the speaker up maybe to 3/4 of the way. Most FRs are going to be pretty clean all the way up. They're not all as flat and as kind of powerful as one another though. So this is going to be something you're going to learn with trial and error, but it's pretty easy to test. Like crank up your modeler, have the volume on your FR nice and low, and then compare that at the same volume level with the opposite setup. Let me know what you like. Have I checked out the band The Night Game, in particular their song The Outfield? I hadn't. I was pretty excited to check this out, and yeah, it kind of sounds like if The Outfield wrote a song in the 21st century that was a big hit. I really like it. I really like the Midnight remix. As soon as I saw there was an association with the Midnight, who are not only one of my favorite synth wave bands, they're just one of my favorite bands, period. I listen to so much of their music. I really, really like that version. So thanks for the tip. I'm definitely going to check out some more of their stuff. This is a question for all the drummers out there. We're talking about Cam, the drummer from Ragdoll. How many cymbals and drum heads does he go through? I'm going to start by saying that we call Cam the Pounder. I know most people know their drummers in their bands, or their friends who play drums will say, oh, I've got a friend, he's a really heavy hitter. Cam's a very, very heavy hitter, and I've seen him absolutely destroy some drum gear. But in general, he seems to be pretty accurate and quite finessed, as well as being quite a heavy hitter. So I've seen him go through stuff, but I've also seen stuff which has survived a lot of tours and a lot of gigs. I know he's got a small Pearl Rhythm Traveler kit that we use for a lot of gigs that we have to drive to here in WA. You know, if we're doing a country gig and it's a 6-hour drive and we all jump in one car, we use the small drum kit. And I'm pretty sure he's had the same skins on that for probably over 7 or 8 years, which is pretty amazing. But I have seen him go through a lot of cymbals, and every time he needs to buy new cymbals, you know, we have that conversation about drummers. They just have it kind of bad because it's really, really expensive. If you break a cymbal, we're talking about hundreds of dollars to replace it. Even a set of sticks, you know, is far more than we would pay for like a set of Ernie Ball slinkies at the guitar store or something like that. So yeah, as guitar players, I think we've got the sweet spot where we've got this hobby where things sometimes break, but they're relatively inexpensive to replace compared to, say, a drummer. Or even worse, if you were a singer and you broke your instrument, that would be terrifying. This is an interesting question, and one I hadn't really thought of. I mentioned at the start of the video that you can check the video description and get some free impulse responses. And someone wanted to know, if you go and use those IRs, say on a commercial recording, say you go and do a session and you use one of my IRs, or you record your band's album and you use one of my IRs, is there any fee associated with that? I hadn't even thought about that. And I thought about it for about 10 seconds and I decided, no, there's no fee in there. I would just be super stoked if you took those IRs and you went and made some music with them, because they required some time and effort on my part, but they didn't require as much time and effort as, say, a commercial impulse response pack. They are the IRs that I use, and it's kind of like presets on something like an Axe Effects, you know. My tone doesn't exist in a particular box or on a particular instrument. It exists somewhere between here and here and here and all the stuff that I use. So I don't feel too possessive of my tone. I don't even really think I have a tone. I'm getting too philosophical at the moment anyway, but the whole idea is sharing is caring. Take those IRs, take those presets, go and make some music with them. That fills me with joy. If anybody's out there doing it and they've recorded stuff with it, send me links to it. I would love to hear it. Truss rod adjustments, I have discussed before. One essential tool that I take with me anytime I travel with a guitar is a little truss rod adjuster tool, because weather changes the setup on your guitar. You know, your guitar's sitting there, it still thinks it's part of a tree. It's having moisture come in and come out, and it's expanding and it's warping and it's doing all those kind of things. So I always take a little truss rod tool, and I find that I only ever really have to tweak my guitar by like an 1/8 or a 1/16 of a turn either way, depending on where I am. Having said that, if you've dropped your guitar and the setup is totally out of whack, take it to someone who can look at the entire setup. You know, somebody like Tim at MT Guitars, who's got a plec. I've taken a few of my guitars to him before and said, hey, I just can't set this particular guitar up. What is up with it? And they've been able to put it on the plec, scan it, and say things like, oh, you've got a ski jump at the end of your fretboard, or you've got a very slight twist in the neck. I even dropped one of my guitars and the neck came off it, and it needed a pretty drastic setup in there. So yeah, if you've dropped your guitar, it's It's probably going to be something a little bit more than just a truss rod adjustment in there. I would take it to a professional and have them look at it. But if you're just thinking about, say, using a truss rod and having it in your guitar case when you're traveling, then there's some pretty straightforward setup stuff that you can watch on the old World Wide Web to figure out how to tweak that. The rule is just very, very small amounts at a time. Setting up a compressor to get a bunch of sustain out of it on something like an Axe Effects, this is something that I should do a video with. It feels like a pretty common request on there. It's one of those things where if you want compression, but you don't want compression, what do you really want out of there? Maybe do you want more gain on your amp? Do you simply want more volume? There's stuff like the output compressor and the gain enhancer in the amp block, which can play into that as well. But in general, I would say you probably want something with a longer release time than normal. And then you can experiment with the ratio. I would say don't be afraid to go really, really extreme in either direction. Like a subtle ratio and a long release might be cool, or slam the compressor really, really hard with a long release. It's going to be a pronounced effect, but at the end of the day, if you want to like change the sustain on your instrument, you're going to need something kind of extreme. So that would be my first instinct in there. I haven't tried this, and feel free to correct me if I'm totally wrong in here, but I just think of like a synthesizer setup where if you want a note to kind of ring out longer, you would change the release on the ADSR. I'm sure you could do some stuff with volume blocks and drive blocks with modifiers where you have them turn up the level, or you could use something like the pitch modifier. This is pretty interesting. I will spend some time with this question and put together like maybe a 5-minute tones video on it if you're interested. One last question for today from Marcelo over in Brazil. When are we coming to Brazil to do some ragdoll shows? That is an all-time bucket list country, just coming to South America or Central America in general. But, you know, just kind of growing up, I watched stuff like Rock in Rio, where Iron Maiden are playing to these massive, massive crowds. And I'm realistic. I don't expect ragdoll would ever play to a crowd like that. I'd be happy to just go there and play some small clubs and just kind of immerse myself in what for me is a very distinct, very different culture from the one that I grew up here in Australia. And that is one of the things that excites me so much. Any person from Brazil that I have met living here in Australia is always fanatical about live music in particular, and they seem to love rock and metal. So that's a dream situation, Marcelo. Hopefully we can make it happen one day. Maybe we should talk about it and see who you know and who I know, and we can work on this dream and make it happen at some point. That's all for this week's video. I hope you all have a fantastic weekend. Again, leave your questions in the comments section for next week and check the video description for all the cool stuff that I mentioned earlier. Take it easy, and I'll see you next time.